Hello, and thank you for tuning into the Keto Answers podcast. Joining me this week is Professor Tim Noakes. Formerly a registered medical doctor, we get into his past, a lot of the controversy he was involved in. So Tim is from South Africa. He was actually in court for 4 years after he promoted a low-carb diet on Twitter, was just under the gun and went through this entire process. We talk about his struggles through that, how he won, why he thinks that happened, and then his life now and how he tries to help people with low-carb living now. So lots of information in this one. Tim is an amazing guy. He is one of the key leaders in this space and is always fighting for the truth. So really respect him and his time, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Tim, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me, Anthony.
So your Twitter profile reads, no longer a registered medical doctor. Do you want to take some time to unpack that? I know it might take a while, but we have some time.
Sure. No, it'd be a pleasure. So I started my medical career in 1969, believe it or not. That makes me 70 years old. And I retired in 2014. And 3 months before I retired, my university decided they'd had enough of me and participated in a public humiliation of me. And I was prosecuted by the Health Professional Council for tweeting the right advice on how you should wean your children.
So let's just pause here. So for using Twitter.
That's correct.
What did you tweet?
I tweeted something to the effect that it's best to wean your child onto the low-carb, high-fat diet, which actually is entirely compatible with all the dietary guidelines all around the world, including the South African guidelines. And so as a front, that I was charged with unprofessional conduct and so on, promoting dangerous ideas and so on. And I had two choices because I hadn't practiced medicine for 15 years. I'm mainly a scientist who wanted to stay in medical practice because you learn a lot, obviously, from seeing patients. But it wasn't what I earned my living. I earned my living as a scientist and a teacher and a researcher with a sideline in medicine for which I was never paid. If I was paid something, I donated the money elsewhere. So earning a living from medicine was not my goal. So anyway, I could have resigned from the Health Professions Council, but if I'd done that, I would have signaled that I was guilty. So I said, no, I'm going to fight this thing, and I don't care what it costs. We're going to fight it. And it took us 4.5 years, and I was in court for 28 days in that 4.5 years. It cost me many millions of South African rands, which is not a lot of money in American terms, but obviously quite a lot of money in South African terms. I was on, and I gave evidence under oath for 9 days, and I was cross-examined for 3.5 days. We went through 6,000 pages of documents supporting our position, and the prosecution, all they could bring was one.
In that position is just that a low-carb, high-fat diet is totally fine and healthy and not dangerous?
Yeah, that's correct. And to show that there was no evidence for the high carbohydrate diet, and the high carbohydrate diet was probably dangerous itself, but there was no evidence that it was healthy. So that was the focus. And we had Nina Teicholz from New York came out as an expert witness. We had Zoe Harcombe from Wales, and we had Karen Zinn from New Zealand as the 3 expert witnesses, and they added another 3 days. They added another 3 days onto my evidence. So at the end of the first trial, which went 25 days, we won 10-0. In other words, 10 counts we won and lost nothing. But the prosecution decided that they would go to an appeal because the lawyer had cost them so much money. He said, I'm embarrassed. I better give you some more days for free. So the Health Professional Council took that offer up, and then we went for 3 more days in the appeal. We won that 3-0. So we won 13 decisions against 0. And there was not one thing that I said during my presentations that they contested. So they could not find fault with anything I said for 9 days or any of the other expert witnesses for 3 days. They couldn't find fault with it. So we won very handsomely. And the moment I had finally won the appeal, I of course resigned from the Health Professional Council because the possibility that there would be a second charge for something else was always there, because we learned that industry was behind this, and it was some American companies, I might add, who had some indirect involvement in it. And you can guess what companies those are. So I was pretty sure that there would be a follow-up sooner or later. So I resigned, and therefore I'm no longer a registered medical doctor. Now on Twitter, I can say exactly what I like, because within the bounds of truth, of course, but at least I can say what I want to without fear that I'm going to be targeted again by my profession.
Yeah. So just to step it back, you said that this is sort of an industry-backed thing. So, I mean, is it that they were just on Twitter and all these companies saw you were recommending low-carb, high-fat diet and then just went after you? What in your perspective transpired over these? Like, why was this the case, and how did they throw so much money at this?
Yeah, so we've written a book which is now available in the United States called Real Food on Trial, and we describe it all there. So you see, my targeting starts in 2012, but I'm only charged in 2015. But it starts in 2012 when the cardiologist at my university, the professor of cardiology, writes a letter to the local newspaper saying that I'm a cholesterol denialist and a statin denialist, and that this is dangerous because the American Cardio Society says that everyone should be on a statin, and Noakes is saying that statins don't work. And this is very dangerous because he's not a cardiologist and he doesn't know the evidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the really interesting thing was that the day that came out was I'd just been awarded the most eminent scientific award in Southern Africa for science. And it came out on the same day. So the result was that on the next day, when the newspaper announced that Tim Noakes has won this award, it wasn't that. It was Tim Noakes is a cholesterol denialist and a statin denialist. And what happened was quite simply, I wrote a book called Challenging Beliefs. And in it, I explained how I'd converted to the low-carb diet. And I said there, gave evidence why I thought that the low-carb diet was healthy and why there was no evidence that the high-fat diet causes heart disease. And then somewhere along the way, I said that there's no real evidence that statins prevent heart disease by lowering cholesterol, and they're pretty ineffective drugs. And the effect was in Cape Town, my town, that the sales of the statins started to fall thereafter. And I know exactly what happened. The pharmaceutical representatives would have reported that the sales were going down. The industry would have phoned up the professor of cardiology and said, we've got to do something about this. We can't allow the statin sales to go down. And so action had to be taken. And so I started to get targeted. Now, they would have taken me to court or reported me to the Health Professions Council if I had said something wrong. If I had, for example, told a patient to stop taking statins and they'd managed to get that evidence. In other words, I'd interfered with a patient, what the doctor had told a patient. They would have taken me to the Health Professional Council, but I'd never said that. So they were waiting. And then along came this tweet, and the dietitians had taken up the charge because we wrote another book called The Real Meal Revolution, which completely changed the face of nutrition teaching in South Africa. Because for the first time, people suddenly saw, gosh, this is a diet that really works. You lose weight and your diabetes is reversed and so on. And when they went to the dietitians and said, but Dr. Noakes says we should be doing this and you say we should be doing that, but I go on this diet and I lose my hunger and I lose my weight and I reverse my diabetes. So why is he wrong? And they would have to defend that. And they got so much negativity that the only way they to answer it was to shut me up. So there was collusion between the Dietitians Association of South Africa and the Health Professions Council, and that's what produced the charge. And initially, they weren't really sure that what I'd said was wrong, and then the Health Professions Council, the committee that decided whether to charge me, colluded with the people who wrote the dietary guidelines in South Africa, which is astonishing. I mean, if you deciding whether the guy's right or wrong, you don't go and ask the people who are the most likely to want to charge you and find you guilty. They didn't do it. So that was how the charge came up. It was collusion, and I was never given a proper chance to defend myself before I was charged, which is not the way the South African system works. You should first get the opportunity to speak to these people and say, listen, I disagree with you, and here's my evidence. No, I was charged and sent to court before I was able to present my argument.
So what has life been like after that?
Fantastic. No, that's wrong. It was hell for 4 years. It was really tough because I was, you see, what happened was I was academically mobbed. The university, the head of medicine and the medical faculty at the University of Cape Town wrote a letter to the Cape Times, which is a local newspaper, explaining why the university now dissociated themselves from Tim Noakes. And this is now 3 months before I retire. And I was apparently no good as a researcher, and I was presenting wrong information that was damaging health, and we knew that the diet's killing people and Noakes is promoting this diet, and therefore the university takes the unusual step of distancing itself from Tim Noakes, which is quite something. After I'd worked for 40 years at the university, earned them a fortune, taught many PhD students, and etc. And in fact, and I just say this not to boast or anything, but I was the second best known scientist in South Africa. There were two of us who were considered the most known, and I was the only person from University of Cape Town who was really quite well known in South Africa. And so they took this action. So I was academically mobbed, and what usually happens with academic mobbing is you commit suicide, because it's awful, because no one will talk to you. Even when I went to work, the people I'd taught and helped in their careers didn't want to know me anymore because I was now vermin. And so that was academic mobbing, and that was really tough. And not only that, but then there was a coordinated action on social media. There were about 5 or 6 trolls, all of whom were coordinating, and most of them were coming from the University of Cape Town, who attacked me and perpetually trolled me. And then outside that, in the media, the private public media, I was being attacked by every organization, like from the Heart Foundation, the Diabetes Associations. They all had a say about why Noakes was so wrong and so bad and so dangerous. So I was getting it from all sides, and it was really tough. And what got me through was firstly my wife, who was incredibly supportive all along. And she every day listened to me, and she said, Tim, for 4 years, all I heard about was this bloody trial. And you unburdening yourself, and you looked terrible. You looked like you were profoundly depressed, which I was, but I had to keep going. And then I had 3 of the best lawyers in the country. 2 of them gave their time to me for free, and they were just unbelievable. I mean, there was no one could have beaten us. With that team, we were going to win. And then eventually we won, and now it's a year ago that the appeal court decision was made, and we've been in heaven ever since. I mean, a couple of people have written to me who were involved in the trial in various ways. And the one person who was very strongly involved in the whole, it wasn't on my side, was on the committee that decided whether I should be guilty or not. She said, Tim, every day you must get down on your knees and you must thank the University of Cape Town and the Health Professional Council for what they did for you, because they pushed you into a very dark space and you had to fight back to save yourself and your life. And you did it, and you advanced the cause of the low carb on a global stage in a way that nothing else could have done it so quickly. And she said, you've advanced the cause 10 years in the 4 years that you went through this thing. And another professor of law from another local university, she wrote to me and said, you can't expect these people to behave. So don't ever expect them to say sorry. They're never going to. And that's, so my wife and I buried all of that, and we're just moving on and really enjoying life.
It's amazing. And so, has there been any major threats or anything after this all wrapped up, or
no, no, there haven't been. I've we've just had a great time and had so much support from the public and continuing goodwill from everyone. And from their side, they'll never apologize. And actually, I don't want them to apologize because they don't mean it anyway. And actually, it's not the apology is not the issue. The issue is how badly they behaved. Their behavior was atrocious. And if they don't understand, and the university doesn't understand how badly these people behaved and how unethically they behaved, then it has a problem, and it does have a major problem. And it needs to address it. Not for my sake, but for the university's sake.
Right. And so you said you weren't practicing for 15 years prior to that. What was and you said you were focused more so as a scientist. What was that transition like? And why were would you give up private practice to jump in on that end?
Yeah, I've always been in academic medicine. Academic sports science. But we opened an institute in 1995. And for about 10 or 15 years, I would do a weekly clinic because that would just keep my eye in. And I would learn stuff from that was good for my research. But after 15 years, because I was getting near the end of my career, I decided I'd rather focus on my science because my science was just really taking off at that time. And I wanted to spend the rest of my time on the science. So that was the reason. I've always wanted to do the science. The clinical practice was never what drove me at all.
And so, when was the moment when you had the aha light bulb moment around low carb, high fat? It seems like everyone in this space sort of has the time they can point back to that says, oh, that's when I finally got it.
Well, I don't know if you read my book, Waterlogged, which talked about over drinking and how the Pepsi-Cola Gatorade scientists promoted over drinking, and then that became part of the consensus of what you should do. You should drink as much as tolerable during exercise. And because I had found patients who'd done that and who'd hurt their health, I knew that was going to be a problem. So anyway, I wrote the book Waterlogged, and it took 30 years before I submitted the book finally for publication. And the night I did it, I hadn't been running much, and I'd been putting on weight progressively for about 10 years for reasons that I'll explain in a second. And so I sent the book off on a Saturday evening, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and my brain said to me, you must get up tomorrow morning and you must run, and you mustn't stop running for the rest of your life. That's what my brain said to me. And I always listen to my brain because it usually has something good to tell me when it's such an important message. So I got up and ran, and I had the worst run of my life. It was terrible. So when I got home, by chance, I opened my emails, and there was an advert. In those days, adverts came on email for whatever reason. And it said, lose 6 pounds in 6 weeks without hunger. And I said, this is complete nonsense. If you're going to lose weight, you have to get hungry. And then I noticed it was written by doctors Volek, Finney, and Westman, who all of I knew. I knew all three of them because they were good scientists. And I said, and the title was the New Atkins for the New You. So I said, they've sold out to Atkins. That is an utter disgrace. I am disgusted that these good scientists could sell out to Atkins. And I was so angry. I got straight in the car and drove to the local bookshop, and I bought the book. It was the last copy they had. And I brought it home. And literally within 2 hours, I said, oh my gosh, I got it wrong for 33 years. I said, I'm in such bad shape. I can't be worse. Surely, if I follow this diet, it's either going to kill me or I'm going to get better. So by lunchtime, I decided no more carbs. And so I cut carbs from that moment. And of course, you don't cut dramatically. I mean, I eat much less carbs now than I did initially, but that's the process that you go through. So anyway, within 2 days, I felt dramatically better because I was clearly diabetic then already. And so reversing, I'm sure my blood glucose started falling immediately. I stopped eating carbs. And then about 6 months later, I finally realized that my fasting glucose was not going to come down and normalize even on the low carb diet. So then I decided that I've got type 2 diabetes, and then I started managing it with obviously with exercise, low carbs, and with metformin. But the dramatic thing for me was my running, because my running had got so bad. And within 6 weeks, it had got back to where I was when I was a 40-year-old. I was running as fast as I had when I was 40, and I was 60 at the time. And I couldn't believe it, because I thought that what had happened to me between 40 and 60, and I'd got slower and slower and slower, was because I was just aging. And it wasn't. It was the high carb diet and my insulin resistance developing my type 2 diabetes. So I had a dramatic response, and I cured a whole bunch of medical conditions, and felt fantastic. And it was a complete awakening. And now I'm 9 years further down the road, and I'm 70, and people are amazed. They see me and they say, "But you're younger than when I saw you last 20 years ago." And it's simply because I've lost weight and I've become extremely healthy on this diet.
And you're still running?
I'm still running, with not as well. My weight bearing isn't so great anymore, but I'm doing a lot of CrossFit now, which I've really found is amazing. So I put on about 3 or 4 kilograms of muscle in my upper body, which I've never had before. And I can do upper body exercises that I could never do before. So at 70, I'm putting on muscle and getting fitter, and I'm keeping up with my running, but it's quite difficult. And I've subsequently learned or read a recent paper suggesting that once you convert to sort of explosive, high intensity weight training, you do lose your ability to adapt to running. And I'm also, of course, now my mind's thinking, and then I read metformin's affecting your ability to adapt to training. And my running definitely went down when I started taking metformin. So my running improved dramatically for about a year or two, and then it started getting worse. And I'm convinced that was a metformin effect. So my running isn't great, but I'm still going to do 5 to 10K runs on a regular basis.
And did you have the same type of stuff when you started with low carb and running, where you weren't feeling appropriately and had to learn over time what the best strategies were?
No, because I was so sick at that time. My glucose was probably between 7 and 8 all the time, 7 and 8 millimoles, which that's probably 130 or something milligrams per 100 ml, probably a bit higher than that. So I was potently diabetic. And I think that the fact that as soon as I dropped, so I'll tell you what I did learn. When I had been on the low carb diet for a long time, I went for glucose tolerance test, and I felt sick for a day because my glucose suddenly shot up to 10 or 11 or 12 again, and I felt sick for a day or two. And I think that when you're diabetic, your brain is so messed up by these high glucoses that anything that changes brings it down, makes you feel better. So that's absolutely what happened to me. I just started feeling better instantly. I went on the diet, and I understand that that's not what everyone experiences, but I was sick at the time that I did it.
Do you do anything for your long runs now, or had you over the last 9-10 years that,
Yes. Yeah, I was running half marathons up to a year ago. There was a half marathon race. And then I decided that with the CrossFit, the training for the running was just a bit too much for me at 69. Who knows? I may return to it again, but I've really focused on the developing the muscle strength, and my glucose control has improved dramatically with that extra 5 or 6 kilograms of my muscle, 4 or 5 kilograms of muscle. I think that I've built some really healthy muscle finally. And so that's swung the balance for my glucose control, which is now so good. I'm reducing my metformin quite dramatically. And it seems that the glucose control is staying pretty much the same.
Which is great.
So I'm hoping, yeah.
And you started doing this when you were 69? Or?
Yeah, I started so
CrossFit?
I was 61, CrossFit actually 68, 69. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you're gaining, you said, but 5-7 kilos of muscle mass?
5, I think 4 to 5, probably 5 at maximum. But my body shape is totally different than it was. And I've actually got upper body strength now. And I can do sit-up push-ups, and I can do pull-ups, and do the lovely burpees, which are the things I hate the most of all.
And I think an important point that you mentioned here was that has allowed your glucose control to be way more stable. Can you speak a little bit more about that, what you experienced sort of before and after?
So what I think once you're on a low carb diet, what happens is your blood glucose becomes homeostatically regulated, but it's still too high. So I wore a glucose monitor for about 2 weeks, some months ago, and I didn't have one spike the whole time, and my average glucose was 5.2. Which is normal. It's a normal fasting glucose. I had a normal fasting glucose all day, every day for 10 days. And that made me think I'm probably over-medicated with metformin. But the point was there were absolutely no spikes. So, but it's not 4.5, which would be perfect for a 20-year-old. It was 5.2. But before I was probably running at 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, but it was homeostatically regulated. So I still didn't have the peaks, none of these spikes because I'm not eating any carbs. But it was still a bit elevated, and it's come down about 0.4 or 0.5. And I think that could well be a result of a larger muscle mass. Or it could be because I'm retired now and I don't have to go out and fight the world every 5 minutes. And so emotionally, I'm probably a bit more stable. But anyway, the point is that I'm not going to stop CrossFit because it's made huge differences to me, and I really enjoy it. And I happen to think it may have helped my glucose control.
Right. So you obviously switched from doing a lot of endurance exercise to doing more of this explosive stuff that I think that a lot of people think is impossible with a low carb diet. Did you have to change your fueling strategies, around workouts or how much you're eating in a day or composition of your food when you switched from doing, longer half marathons, training for that versus what you're doing currently?
No, I never changed. I just don't eat carbs, and I've stuck with it. And when I adapted in December 2010, I ran a half marathon 4 months later in a time that I was now equal to what I'd done 20 years earlier. And I had no carbs before or during. And I must admit, during the race, I was concerned. So I took some goos with me, but never needed them. And in fact, sped up at the end. The fastest part of the race was the last 4 kilometers, last 3 miles or so. So I learned then that I didn't need any carbs for that distance, for 21 Ks. And I have not changed anything. I'm eating less carbs than ever. I just almost eat zero carbs at the moment. Yeah.
So what does your daily intake and nutrition look like?
It is so simple. It is the food. I only eat eggs, meat, fish, dairy, nuts, and almost no vegetables, just a trace of vegetables. I've become much more carnivorous. And I've been influenced by the people on Twitter showing that you can survive on a carnivorous diet. And now when I eat vegetables, I don't feel so good because I think my gut's adapted, the biome has adapted for not having vegetables. So that's it. I just eat those foods. I eat a lot of eggs, quite a lot of bacon, a lot of fish, a lot of red meat, a lot of what we call jerky or biltong in this country, quite a lot of nuts. And that's it. It's the most simple diet that you could ever have. And it doesn't have much variety in it, but I love it because I sit down and I eat one meal a day usually, and that's it. And I'm completely satiated. So my calorie consumption has probably gone down by half. I definitely know it had gone down 30%, but I think I'm even eating less now than before. Okay. So it's a very simple diet. But remember, I am 70, and I think at 70, you need to stoke up on the protein. So when I started when I was 61, I was eating a lot more fat because fat satiated me, and that took my hunger away, and that allowed me to control my weight. But as time has gone on, I don't need as much fat to satiate me. I can get it on protein, and I think the protein's important for, as you age, to keep your muscle mass going.
Got it. And so when did you first start switching to a primarily carnivorous diet?
I think the thing that influenced me probably was Sean Baker on Twitter, where he's just completely carnivorous, and he's very, very athletic and very strong. And then Michaeli Peterson, Jordan Peterson's daughter, who reversed her multiple diseases by going completely carnivorous. And I think that convinced me that there may be problems with some plant-based foods for some people.
And so you just sort of did an experiment for yourself to see how
that's when I started.
Yeah,
I just didn't have if the vegetables were given to me on the plate, I generally wouldn't eat them.
Huh. And is there anything that you noticed when you started doing it that way that you felt differently?
Sorry, I didn't get that question.
Is there anything that you noticed when you switched to primarily a carnivorous diet that, any changes in health status or energy levels, anything like that, mood?
Not really, just pretty much the same. But I just started to lose interest actually in eating vegetables. I think that was what happened really. And, I suspect that when I was brought up by a mother who came from a meat industry. And I suspect that I was pretty carnivorous. We were brought up pretty carnivorous, and we didn't have a huge amount of vegetables and starchy foods when I was growing up at the early stage. Then I went to boarding school, and of course, then that's when you get the starchy foods hit you. But I think in my first 8 or 10 years of life, I think I probably ate a lot of meat and not all that much vegetables.
Got it. And then a point that you talked about a little bit was protein levels. I think that there's a lot of people right now who obviously talk about animal protein being very bad for you or causing cancer, things like this. So, what is your take on protein levels in general? I mean, should we limit them? Should we get as much as possible? Should we just eat to satiation?
Yeah. I think I just eat to satiation, and I don't, count the calories or count the grams of fat. I just eat what my body tells me. So if I do eat a lot of protein, I might find that I'm still hungry, so then I'll eat fat. But I just listen to my body. Whatever my body tells me to eat, that's what I'll eat. The reason for more protein is when I read the literature, it's very clear to me that there are two eras when you need more protein. And the one is when you're born, and the other is as you get older. And of course, I went to court on the first one about that babies should be weaned onto high protein, high fat diets. And the evidence is absolutely clear. And particularly in a country like South Africa, where the majority do not eat high protein, they're not weaned. They're weaned onto maize or corn, as you call it. They're weaned onto corn-based foods, and that's just disastrous. They're not getting enough protein. And all the evidence now is coming through that you need more protein. And what's interesting at my age of 70 is people are starting to fall off the wagon. They're starting to age quickly, and they're starting to get cancers and dying. And what I notice is that the older people who aren't doing the exercise, they're becoming stooped, they're becoming osteoporotic, they're becoming osteopenic. And it becomes apparent after the 60s. So I just think that they got the diet all wrong. They've had far too much carbohydrate, not enough fat, not enough protein, and that now they're paying the price for it. And it becomes apparent as soon as you start going beyond 60s, and certainly by the time you're 70, it's very apparent. So that's my reason for thinking that you need more protein as you get older.
Got it. And I mean, what about midlife? You think that do you think there's any risk for extremely high protein diets? I'm 31. Is there any risk that I eat a lot of protein and that's not good for me?
No, I don't think so. There's, I think back historically, humans evolved on high protein, high fat diets.
Right.
They ate a lot of fat until we killed all the fat animals, and then we had to start eating carbohydrates. But so it's not quite right to say that it was predominantly a protein diet. It was much more fat in the diet early on, 2 million years ago, a million years ago. So that was the diet that sustained us and developed our big brains. So it can't be that that's the diet that's going to kill us today. It just doesn't make sense. And the problem is that there's this huge move by industry to promote vegan, vegetarian, plant-based diets. And it's only commercially because they make much more money. And they would like to put the farmers out of business and just be selling cereal-based diets. And that's terrible because we know that that's what people are eating. I mean, most people in America and in my country are eating, most of their calories are not coming from meat and dairy and animal produce. They're coming from plants. And look what's happened. So if we're going to make people go even more plant-based, it's going to get worse. So I would not worry about eating too much animal protein. You'll be fine.
Do you think that, you obviously went through a lot of work propelling, like you said, the low carb, being all right for you in being safe and all this other stuff? Do you think that you're going to have another time on the stand, so to speak, with the consumption of animal products and more of a...
I'm sorry, the end of your question cut out. I think the line just went bad there.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that you're going to spend time sort of like how you did assuring people that a low carb diet is safe, much like that with the carnivorous diet? Or, I mean, it seems like this is another thing that as it's cropping up, a lot of people are getting results, like you said, but so many people have such skepticism on it that not only is it not good, it's extremely unhealthy.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a long fight. And I feel sorry for the people who are clearly sick and who don't realize the cause, that the cause is addiction to the processed foods. And the processed food industry goal is to addict us. And they've done it very successfully. And I get so frustrated when I see people, telling me that my diet's unhealthy, and I look at them and I realize, no, it's not my diet that it's unhealthy, it's your diet. I mean, I saw a lady yesterday, she was almost crying because her husband's a cardiologist and she's put on weight and she's fat and she's got a high cholesterol. And she said, I've tried everything on this diet and now I want to try your diet, but my husband tells me it'll kill me because he's a cardiologist. And I said, but hold on, what diet are you eating now? No, it's this high carb diet. And I said, but has it helped you? No, it's killing me. I said, well, there you go. You see, don't you see it? So that's the issue. But eventually, the leaders in this field are the ones who converted because we were sick. It's as simple as that. We realized that we were sick and we wanted to change, and we found an answer. And the reason that we're so very supportive of the idea is we just see the benefits. Let me give you an example. When we wrote the book, The Real Meal Revolution, which used the word banting for the diet. So in South Africa, we use the word banting rather than low carb diet. And because that's the term that got named, the diet got named the banting diet. No one knew what the banting diet was 5 years ago. 3 years ago, a Facebook page started this banting 7-day meal plan Facebook page. Today it has 1.8 million members in the Western Cape, here where I live. 1.8 million members. And those stories are absolutely dramatic, of people losing 100 pounds, etc. That's not uncommon for people to report that, and curing all their conditions. And when you see that, you say, no, this is something that is really valuable for so many people. So I'm fairly sure that the banting diet has literally helped millions of South Africans and many millions of other people around the world.
Right. And that was just was it William Banting who...
That's correct.
Wrote a letter. Was it a letter on corpulence?
Corpulence.
Yeah.
The funniest thing is his great-great-great-great-great-grandson lives in Australia and wrote to me and said, Dr. Noakes, I hate to tell you, but your diet's not the Banting diet, because he said Banting actually ate bread and he ate 4 meals a day, and you're telling people to eat no bread and eat only once a day. So yours not the Banting diet. That's a Tim Noakes diet that you're talking about. So he wants to claim the name. Yeah, Banting ate bread.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And yeah, he did, and in fact I think there were a couple of other things he ate which were carbs, and there were things he wasn't allowed to eat because they thought they contained carbs, but they didn't.
So this just maybe it's an awareness of what actually was carbohydrate containing or not.
Yeah, that's correct. There was some, but actually it was more complex than that, because the diet was prescribed to him by a chap called Dr. William Harvey. And when William Harvey described it, people said, okay, if it works, how does it work? And why does it work? That's really interesting, isn't it? Doctors have to have an explanation.
Right.
It works. Can't you see it works? But anyway, and poor old Harvey couldn't come up with an explanation because, of course, they didn't know anything about intermediary metabolism in those days. And so he said, no, it's because it's a high protein content. So he changed the diet until it became low fat, high protein, moderate carbohydrate. So that was the real Harvey diet. And Banting said, no, Dr. Harvey, your diet doesn't work anymore. And he told him. And anyway, that was the Harvey diet. But the diet went to Germany, called the Epstein diet. A cardiologist called Epstein took it over, and he said, it's the fat in the diet. That's why you get healthy on this diet. He wasn't concerned about protein, but he said it's all based on the fat in the diet that makes it a healthy diet.
It seems like the common thread here is that there's low or no carbohydrates.
Absolutely. And even all the diets that work for type 2 diabetes are all low carbs. It doesn't matter. There are the low calorie diets, the 800 calorie diets, which also show that you can reverse diabetes on an 800 calorie diet. But the reality is it's a low carbohydrate diet. If you eat a low calorie diet, which has lots of carbs in it, it's not going to help you.
Do you think that the fact that, because I know it's popular where you're at and in UK as well, calling it a Banting diet, do you think that it being a named diet is harder for popularity to spread and for research to be done? Or, is that not taboo there? Because, here, for instance, similar thing, obviously, a couple of decades ago, Atkins diet, where, if there's any research done on an Atkins diet, being it as a named diet, there's a lot of dogma around it, and there's a lot of agenda for people to sell products, things like that. Whereas I think what has helped a tremendous amount in the last 5-10 years is that, calling it ketosis, but we can actually measure it, and it's a metabolic process instead of named after one person who comes up with some idea that's easy to straw man. Have you ever noticed that being, something that if we switch to calling it more low carb or ketogenic diet, that there'd be a little bit more credibility, maybe in the mainstream or anything else like that?
Yeah, I can understand exactly your argument. It just happens that in South Africa, it worked. The name Banting worked. And literally after we'd written that book, and by the way, my choice, I had nothing to do with the diet title or the use of the name Banting. The night before the book was sent to the editors, the guy whose idea it was, he changed LCHF for Banting. He threw out the text. He just changed it on the computer, replaced LCHF with Banting. And that was a masterstroke because people got this lovely, fantastic new name. So it helped in South Africa. And why it did that, but it just took off. And had we called it LCHF, it wouldn't have worked as well. But I can understand entirely your point of view. Incidentally, it's very important to make the point that Atkins was actually in a long line of Americans who had promoted the low-carb diet. He was about the fourth or fifth. And without Atkins, we wouldn't have had the Virta Health Company, which funded the studies which show low-carb diets can reverse type 2 diabetes. So I've written a column for CrossFit, and it's just been published. And I think it was the one that's just been published. And it says Atkins is the most important person on diet in the United States because he's the direct link for the guys who were promoting the diet in the 1920s to Virta Health. Without him, Virta Health wouldn't have happened.
Right.
And so he's critically important. And one day he will be properly recognized for his contribution. But I agree, at the moment, people still try to demonize him for being wrong. But he wasn't wrong, he was right.
So do you think that, speaking of CrossFit and, writing some articles for them and what they recommend, it's sort of, they started early on recommending a zone diet, sort of paleo-ish zone, which is, not super low in carbohydrates. Do you think that for some people whose main goal is performance, that would be better to eat more carbohydrates when doing something like CrossFit? Or what is your thought on low carb versus moderate high carb?
So I must just tell you that that they've just had the CrossFit Games in Madison, Wisconsin this last weekend. And my friend Zoe Harcom, who was one of expert witnesses, she was invited there to give a talk. I was invited, but I couldn't make it this year. I went 2 years ago. And she said, that at one dinner she was with some of the champions, and there were two young ladies there who were champion CrossFitters. And they were complaining how they were always hungry and they couldn't control their weight and they always had to snack. And she says, tell me, what are you eating? She says, no, carbs. So she said, well, actually, let me tell you a few things about eating carbs. And maybe if you just change to have a bit more fat in your diet, you'd be okay. Now, I do think that if you're doing a lot of explosive exercise, you probably do need a little bit more carbohydrate, but not to the extreme that we went in the 70s and 80s when I was promoting the low-carb diet and people were just killing themselves with so much carbohydrate. There may well be a role for more carbohydrate, but I still think you want to get by on as little carbohydrate as possible for your long-term health. Because if you are insulin resistant like I was, and I now know that I was profoundly insulin resistant, running all these marathons didn't make any difference. So even if you're doing CrossFit, you can't stuff in the carbs. You need to be a bit more cautious and find out what's the minimum amount of carbs you need to maximize your performance. Which is the opposite of what we do. We maximize the carbs and assume that the performance we get is perfect.
And so for people who, you mentioned insulin resistance, for people who aren't really familiar with all the downsides that comes with it, I mean, what are some of the things that we should be looking out for there?
Yeah, so insulin resistance, and that's a series I'm writing about now for CrossFit. And so anyone who would like to know a little bit about insulin resistance and its history and how it got missed, because it's still not taught in medical schools, and it is the most prevalent medical condition across the world. And so it's estimated that 88% of North Americans are metabolically unhealthy, and most of it is insulin resistance. But if you can get any medical student and say, tell me about insulin resistance, they won't have a clue. They wouldn't be able to tell you anything about it. So insulin resistance is an inability to metabolize carbohydrate effectively without over-secreting insulin, because your body is resistant to the action of insulin. And ultimately, this leads to most of the chronic diseases are linked to insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets. That's what we've really learned in the last 20 years, that diabetes, hypertension, gout, obesity, dementia, perhaps cancer, gallstone disease, and a whole bunch of other diseases are all directly linked to insulin resistance. And so the treatment of insulin resistance is a low carbohydrate diet. You can't reverse the underlying condition, but the underlying condition is fine. It won't kill you. It's the carbohydrates that kill you. And so you can be insulin resistant. As long as you're not eating carbs, you'll be fine. So that's what everyone has to find out. What is my level of insulin resistance? If I am insulin resistant, I need to start cutting my carbs. And you said you're 31 years old, which would be perfect, because even if you were severely insulin resistant at the age of 31, it's plenty of time to cut your carbs, and you'll never get diabetes. But if at 31 you happen to be insulin resistant and you're eating 300 grams of carbs a day, you will become diabetic in due course, or at high risk of developing diabetes in due course. And so that's the message people need to get. They need to understand there are 10% of the population who can eat all the carbs they like, and that's fantastic, but 90% can't. And most of us are going to fall in that 90%.
Right. So like you said, there's not really a great way to exercise your way out of this. There's not a lot of other lifestyle things that's all pretty much driven by nutrition.
No, you can't. You can run all your life, as I did. So I ran 70 marathons and ultra marathons, and I now know that already at 28, when I was running 70 miles, 80, 90 miles a week, running marathons once every 3 or 4 months, and I was profoundly insulin resistant, and I became diabetic eating that high carbohydrate diet. So all that running made no difference. And my great friend Bruce Fordyce, who won the Comrades Marathon, which is a 56-mile race, 9 times, he became insulin resistant, put on weight. We put him on the low-carb diet, reversed it all. He never became diabetic, but probably because he's physically better, much better physical specimen than I am. But he was insulin resistant as well. And I've got many other friends who are really great athletes who became progressively more insulin resistant during their 40s and 50s, even though Bruce Fordyce has run the most of any South African in history, yet he becomes insulin resistant.
Yeah, and I think that your story as well about, what are you, 61 or so, when you switch to this, gaining muscle now and you're 69, I think that, like you said, it's not too late to switch. I think that that's it should be a case for our entire lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, the problem was that I was eating as I told you, I was eating a high meat diet when I was younger. And then in 1977, the dietary guidelines changed, and I happened to be studying cardiology. So what do? The professors are going to force you to eat it. I mean, you couldn't have not eaten the high carb, low fat diet and changed to margarine and vegetable oils. And what a catastrophic decision. And my running just got worse progressively from that moment. And so the insulin resistance was already there, and it was just affecting my running. And I could never control my weight, and I could never understand it. Why? I was always hungry and binge eating and so on. And of course, now I know fully exactly what the problem was.
I mean, you mentioned that dietary guidelines being screwed up. Is there any chance that we get back to a baseline to even resemble closely what you're doing now? What are your thoughts on, you spoke about dietary guidelines being messed up in the 70s. I mean, is there any possibility for us to go back to what should resemble a normal human diet? And what is the work that needs to be done to get there?
Yeah, they just need to look at the evidence. You see, that's the problem. Nina Teicholz, of course, was one of my expert witnesses, and she's kind of been trying to drive this argument, and has published papers in the British Medical Journal, etc., showing that the dietary guidelines have never considered all the evidence. They only consider the evidence that promotes a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. They ignore all the randomized controlled trials which show that a low-fat diet is detrimental to health. They completely write it out. And the only evidence they look at is the associational studies coming out of Harvard Medical School. And that's the problem. So if you look at all the evidence, there's absolutely no question that there is a major part for this low-carbohydrate diet to play. And her argument is simple. Listen, excuse me. We don't want everyone to eat a low-carb diet. We just want an option. And she said, as soon as you give people that option, the majority will discover that they do best on that diet, and then we've won the war. But industry is so powerful. There are almost trillions of dollars, certainly billions of dollars, invested in advertising the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, particularly now this vegan diet, and the fact that eating meat is supposedly bad for the environment, which of course it isn't. So there's so much pressure now, a commercial pressure to stop eating meat. And if we stop eating meat and stop eating animal produce, our health is going to get worse very, very severely. So the answer is that the key is that the Dietary Guidelines Committee has to be independent of all commercial influences, but they aren't. And secondly, they have to look at all the evidence. And when they do that, they will see what the truth is. The column I'm currently writing for the CrossFit is about Ansel Keys. And he comes up with this cholesterol theory of heart disease, the diet-heart hypothesis, and he literally sucked it out of his thumb. Absolutely. And I show that absolutely clearly. In 1949, he says there's no dietary influence on arterial disease. No one has ever written that up, but I found the reference that he gives an interview with the local newspaper in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And he says to the guy, there's absolutely no evidence that diet plays any role in atherosclerosis. 3 years later, without any evidence to change his mind, he says it's absolutely abundantly clear that a high-fat diet causes high cholesterol, and that causes arterial disease. And that's it.
Right.
And he then convinces everyone. And he, by chance, his diet happens to be prescribed for President Eisenhower, who has a heart attack in 1955. And Eisenhower is put on this experimental diet for which there was no evidence whatsoever. He's put on this experimental diet. His arterial disease gets worse. He has 6 heart attacks subsequent to that heart attack. And he dies in intractable heart failure. His arteries are completely obstructed. There's no blood getting to his heart. And he is on this diet. And so he is the first example of how this low-fat diet kills your arteries. Meanwhile, while he's dying, Keys is being lauded by the world as the savior of the world and preventer of heart disease. He's on the cover of Time magazine. And this is happening to Eisenhower, who's his first patient on this diet. And no one has ever asked, if the diet killed Eisenhower, what's it going to do to me? And Eisenhower, by the way, was the perfect patient. He did absolutely everything that these doctors told him. He was profoundly optimistic. He had low blood pressure. He didn't have any other risk factors except diabetes. He was insulin resistant. And so he was an insulin resistant person who was given a high carbohydrate diet, and that will kill you. And he developed his diabetes on the diet, and the diabetes killed him. And no one, apart from Gary Taubes a few years ago in his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and that's where I got the story from, and then I went to it in great detail. No one ever says, if the low-fat diet killed Eisenhower, why should it save my life?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Why people wouldn't ask that?
Yeah, exactly. And because it's inconvenient and industry doesn't want us to hear it, and so it's rather, rather send Noakes to jail than have him ask that question.
And so, I mean, is this sort of what you're trying to tackle with the Noakes Foundation, or tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when we wrote The Real Meal Revolution, we made quite a lot of money, and I always donate all my money to good causes that I make in writing, because I don't want people to say Noakes just writes to make money, which I've never done. I've invested everything I've got from my books. And so we decided to form the foundation. And we have the things that are really working well is, firstly, we're raising money to do low-carb research, and we've done pretty well on that. We've got some nice papers, one in the Journal of Physiology showing that measuring the rate of glucose production in the liver in people on this diet and showing it's completely normal and it's absolutely perfect. And there's no risk that your blood glucose level is going to go down because you're not eating carbohydrates. So there's that component. Then there's the component of what we call the Eat Better South Africa campaign, because the people who eat the worst diets are the poorest people in my country and in your country. And no one cares. No one cares at all. And we're the only people who have reached out to those poor communities and said, we can help you make the right choices. And what's remarkable is that these people living in relative poverty, not absolute poverty, but relative poverty, you teach them what they should be eating and they get it very quickly. And then they start to feel better and their health improves. And so we have a randomized control trial, which we're just about to start, looking at taking some of the poorest people in Cape Town and putting them on the low-carb diet. Affordable version costs roughly $2 a day. $2 a day, you can feed people a healthy diet in this country, and seeing what happens. And we're very hopeful that we'll see some really remarkable effects. And then the third thing we do is we have a thing called the Nutrition Network, where we teach doctors and nurses and dietitians how to prescribe this diet. And that has been a runaway success. So we're very excited about that, because that funds our interventions in the communities, trying to get the message out that what the poorest people should be eating to make them healthy.
So, I mean,
so that's where we are at the moment.
And what can people do to support the foundation?
Well, I think just let people know about it, and particularly the Nutrition Network. If you can draw people's attention to the Nutrition Network, and maybe for some of them they want to be on the programs and to sign up for the teaching programs, that would be very helpful, because that's an important source of income that we use then to drive our research programs. And the more money we get through the Nutrition Network, the more trials we can do of this low-carb diet in poor communities. And our goal one day is to change one complete community from being eating sugar and rubbish carbs to completely eating this diet, the entire community. Because we think that the crime rates will come down and everything will happen that is good for the community if they can just get off the sugar, and from a young age, so the children aren't disadvantaged right from the word go, because they've eaten such a poor diet during the weaning period.
Got it. Great. Well, Tim, thanks for your time. I mean, I know you're a busy guy, so I don't want to eat up all your day, but I mean, if there's anything that you just mentioned, two great sources for people to go to, anywhere else that people can find your work?
No, I think the Noakes Foundation is probably the best. And then again, as I've indicated, just do follow the writing on CrossFit, because when I started writing for CrossFit, Greg Glassman, who's been amazing, helpful to me. I mean, he's been so supportive of me because he knows what happens when industry challenges you, and because CrossFit is a great disruptor, and his goal is to disrupt medicine actively with 20,000 doctors who are CrossFit exponents. And I'm so supportive of him, but he's been very supportive. And so I write for him, and looking at the history of how we got into this mess, this nutrition mess, and how the first columns I show that in the 1950s, everyone knew that it was high blood triglyceride levels that caused heart disease in people with diabetes. Everyone knew that. That was the evidence. And along comes this fake cholesterol story from Keys. And there's a moment in 1955, 1956 where we divert. And the knowledge that triglycerides, the problem, gets suppressed because triglycerides are driven by carbohydrates in people with diabetes and insulin resistance. And it's driven from that, and we get the cholesterol story, which is completely wrong. And that is the moment when we get this terrible dietary advice, which then causes the obesity diabetes epidemic. Yep. And so if you read that, you will realize, oh my gosh, that's where the error happened.
Great. And we'll grab that and put it in the show notes as well. And then I think that also, I want to just promote your Twitter as a Prof. Tim Noakes, just because if I could just have your personal Twitter feed as the feed that when I log in, as what I see, it's like you have such a well curated feed where, I mean, you're retweeting a lot of stuff that you're coming across all the time, and super, super active, keeps me busy during the day.
No, thank you. I put a lot of effort in, as you can see. I put in a couple of hours a day. And unlike a lot of Twitter feeds where it's all about the person, it's not about me. This is about the community. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to make it available to anyone who would like to promote their ideas about the low-carb diet on the science side, particularly. So that if there's good science that they come across, I want them to put it on my Twitter feed. So that's been my goal, and I'm glad that you found it's been helpful for you. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're doing a hell of a job, so keep it up.
Thank you.
All right, Tim, thanks for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been a fabulous hour. I really appreciate your time. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.